But in one of the fragments where, the divine name shows up, and in Greek it would usually be kurios, Lord, which typically translates.
Hidden for many years, a tiny Dead Sea Scroll fragment was thought too damaged to read, but new AI tools have finally revealed its message, and the meaning is far darker than anyone imagined. This simple piece of ancient writing hints at danger, fear, and coming disaster. Join us as we explore this powerful discovery and why it shook scholars. The Forgotten Library, hidden in the hills of Qumran. The story of the Dead Sea Scrolls begins in a quiet and unexpected way, high in the dry hills near the Dead Sea. These hills hold caves that sit like dark mouths in the rock, places most people would walk past without a second thought. But one day, long ago in the middle of the 20th century, a young shepherd wandered through this land with his goats. He stepped into one of the caves, later called Cave 1, hoping to find a lost animal. Instead, he found jars covered in dust and filled with ancient scrolls. He had no idea that his discovery would become one of the greatest archaeological moments of all time. After that first surprise, more caves were searched. In the end, 11 caves were found to contain pieces of old writings. From these caves came tens of thousands of fragments, some large and easy to handle, others so tiny they looked like dried leaves. Each piece held part of a much bigger story, one that dated back more than 2,000 years. This collection gave the world a view into life, faith, and community at a time when ancient traditions shaped entire cultures. The writings came in many forms. There were biblical manuscripts that matched or even predated the versions people read today. There were sectarian writings that described rules, beliefs, and daily practices of the group that likely lived nearby. Hymns were found too, filled with praise and deep emotion expressed in simple, powerful lines. Scholars also uncovered commentaries that explained sacred texts and legal codes that guided behavior, rituals, and decision-making. The variety showed that the people who created these texts had a rich spiritual life and took their beliefs very seriously. For many years, people have asked the same question: who wrote these scrolls? There are several theories, and each one opens a different window into the past. One common idea is that the Essenes, a strict and disciplined Jewish group, created and stored the scrolls. They were known for living in isolated communities and following detailed rules, which matches much of what the scrolls describe. Other scholars believe the Sadducees, another ancient Jewish group, could be behind the writings. A smaller number of experts think the scrolls may have come from several groups, not just one, meaning the caves might have served as a shared hiding place during dangerous times. Today, the modern view leans toward the Essenes, but debates continue, adding even more mystery to the story. Even though tens of thousands of fragments were found, many of them are extremely hard to read. Time has not been kind to these ancient treasures. Some pieces were burned long ago, leaving only dark edges and faint marks. Others suffered from humidity that caused the parchment to weaken. Many were damaged by insects, leaving holes where words once sat. Natural decay over centuries slowly ate away at the surfaces, erasing letters and breaking apart sentences. Some fragments are so small they are no bigger than a fingernail. Trying to piece them together is like solving a puzzle without knowing what the final picture looks like. There are also pieces with missing ink, where the writing faded until it became nearly invisible. Others were crushed by pressure inside the caves, leaving the text wrinkled and twisted. Every fragment requires patience, skill, and gentle handling. Scholars must move carefully, knowing that one wrong touch could cause a piece to break apart forever. Even with all these challenges, the Dead Sea Scrolls remain one of the most important discoveries in human history. But why was a fragment of the Dead Scroll kept hidden for decades? What were they trying to hide? The silent fragment, hidden in the dust of Qumran. The story of this mysterious fragment begins deep in the rugged hills that surround the Dead Sea, a place where the heat is sharp, the wind is dry, and the land itself feels ancient. Among the many discoveries made in this region, one small piece of parchment stood out not because of what it revealed, but because of what it refused to say. The fragment was found during one of the major excavations carried out in the mid-20th century. Not long after the first scrolls were discovered, teams searched cave after cave, hoping to uncover anything that could help them understand the world of the people who once lived near Qumran. This particular piece came from one of the later excavated caves, a place where the floor was covered with dust, broken pottery, and pieces of parchment that had fallen apart over many centuries. The team carefully gathered every scrap, and the fragment was given its catalog number, just like the others. It was logged, labeled, and placed with the rest of the collection. At first, no one paid much attention to it. Compared with the larger, clearer scrolls, this tiny piece seemed unimportant. It was dark, heavily damaged, and impossible to read with the tools scholars had at the time. While other manuscripts revealed full chapters, long teachings, or detailed rules, this fragment showed nothing but faint marks. Many experts believed it was too ruined to ever be useful. With so many more promising texts to study, it slipped quietly into the background. The decision to store it away came naturally. The parchment was in terrible condition. Time had worn it down more deeply than most other pieces found in the caves. It had a dark, almost charred appearance that made it difficult for light to pass through. When scholars tried to examine it under special lamps, the surface stayed stubbornly black, refusing to reveal the writing beneath. The biggest challenge was the ink. It had weakened so much that even a gentle touch caused tiny flakes to fall away. Every movement risked losing more of the text. This made the fragment too fragile for long sessions of study. Experts decided it was safer to place it in careful storage than to risk damaging it further. The hope was that new technology would one day make it possible to read without touching it. As the years passed, the fragment became something of a quiet mystery. Even though it remained locked away, scholars continued to talk about it in private conversations. Some wondered if the unusual darkness of the parchment meant it had been exposed to fire or extreme heat. Others noticed small patterns in the faded lines and guessed that it might have belonged to a text connected to warnings or visions. This idea drew interest because the Qumran library already included writings that describe future battles and times of hardship. There were several attempts to uncover its secrets. Researchers tried using infrared lamps, hoping the ink would glow under the special light. It did not. They tried multispectral cameras, devices that could read markings invisible to the human eye. These cameras worked well on many other scrolls, but not on this one. Every test ended the same way, with the fragment showing nothing except its dark, silent surface. These failures only fueled more speculation. Some scholars whispered that the text might contain rare words or unusual teachings. Others wondered if it came from a copyist who used different ink or a different writing method. A few thought it might be part of an early apocalyptic document, not because they had proof, but because its secrecy and stubborn silence made it feel different from the rest. Over time, the fragment became known not for what it said, but for what it refused to reveal. Locked safely away, it waited as new discoveries unfolded around it. The world changed. Technology grew stronger, and scholars continued to wonder what message lay hidden in those darkened lines. What made these scrolls unique, and how were they able to survive for decades? The hidden life of the scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are not only famous for the words they carry, but also for the long, difficult journey their fragile materials have taken through history. These ancient texts survived heat, dryness, and centuries of silence inside desert caves. Later, they faced the mistakes of early handlers and the sudden touch of a world unprepared to protect them. Their story is not just about what they say, but about how they stayed alive long enough for people today to read and study them. Every piece carries marks of age, skill, and struggle, and these marks reveal just as much as the letters written on them. When the scrolls were first discovered, scholars wanted to know exactly how old they were. In the early years after their discovery, a small piece of linen from one of the caves was carbon dated. The result gave an approximate time around the early 1st century, with a range of a few hundred years on both sides. This early test helped scholars rule out the idea that the scrolls came from medieval times. It was the first step toward understanding their true age. After this first result, many more tests were carried out. Over later decades, teams performed 2 large series of radiocarbon studies on the materials. Scholars who collected and studied these results said the evidence showed something very clear. Most of the scrolls were written between the last 2 centuries before the Common Era and the 1st century of the Common Era. This placed them close to the time of major events in ancient Jewish history, making their words even more valuable. The work did not stop there. In the year 2025, samples from 30 scrolls were studied again using advanced radiocarbon testing. These samples came from several locations: 25 from the caves at Qumran, 1 from Masada, 2 from the Murabat caves, and 2 from the Nahal Hever caves. What made this study special was the use of an artificial intelligence model called Enoch. This model looked closely at handwriting styles in scrolls that already had firm dates. It was trained using mathematics that helped it learn patterns in the writing. Enoch was then used to estimate the age of more than 100 manuscripts that had never been dated before. This gave scholars a deeper understanding of when different scrolls were written and how the writing styles changed over time. Another important method used to study the scrolls was the analysis of the letters themselves. Scholars who specialized in ancient writing looked at the size of the letters, their shapes, and the way the scribes formed them. By examining how handwriting changed over time, they could estimate when each piece of text was created. Their findings supported the idea that the scrolls belonged to the period from the 3rd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. Later radiocarbon tests supported this range, though with a wider spread of dates. Scientists also studied the ink used in the scrolls. Using equipment at a university laboratory in California, they discovered that all of the black ink was made from carbon. The red ink, found only a few times across the entire collection, was made from a bright mineral called cinnabar. Most of the carbon ink came from soot produced by burning olive oil in lamps. To make the ink smooth and easy to write with, scribes sometimes added honey, water, oil, or vinegar. They also added galls from certain plants to make the ink stronger and help it stick to the parchment. The writing was done with reed pens, tools that left sharp and steady lines. The surfaces of the scrolls were made from different materials. Most were written on parchment made from treated animal skins. A smaller number was written on papyrus. An even smaller group, a tiny part of the full collection, was written on thin sheets of bronze made mostly of copper. Scholars who studied the parchment used DNA methods to learn more about the animals the skins came from. They discovered that the type of animal used seemed to reflect how important the text was to the community. Texts written on goat or calf hides were often considered more important, while those on gazelle or ibex hides were seen as less central. Tests carried out in Sicily suggested that some pieces of parchment were made using water from the Qumran area. This supported the idea that at least part of the collection had been created near the caves where it was discovered. The survival of the scrolls was strongly shaped by the environment where they were found. The dry air around the Dead Sea helped preserve the parchment for centuries. The caves had almost no airflow, which slowed down decay. Some scrolls were stored inside clay jars, which kept them even safer. But when the scrolls were removed from the caves, they began to suffer. Early handling was careless. They were stored in rooms with uncontrolled temperature and humidity. Tape was used to hold pieces together, and this caused serious damage. Some fragments began to crumble, darken, or fade. Over time, the situation became worse. Scrolls stored in banks, museums, and private homes continued to deteriorate. Moist conditions caused mildew. Chemicals from tape and envelopes damaged the ink and parchment. Many pieces became unreadable, and some were lost entirely. By the late 1950s, scholars estimated that a small but real portion of the scrolls had already disappeared. Efforts to save the scrolls grew stronger in the following decades. Scholars and museum workers tried different methods to remove tape and preserve the pieces, but some attempts caused more harm. It was not until the early 1990s that a fully controlled laboratory was built to care for the scrolls properly. The new environment used clean materials, safe containers, and stable temperatures. It stopped the rapid decay that had threatened the collection for so long. In later years, tiny pieces that had been forgotten for decades were rediscovered and studied again. Despite the complex writing and the age of these scrolls, an AI machine was able to decode the secrets it protected. The machine that unlocked the fragment. For many years, the mysterious fragment hidden in storage seemed impossible to understand. Scholars tried every tool available, yet it stayed silent, refusing to reveal even a trace of meaning. Its surface was too dark, its ink too damaged, and its fragile edges too risky to touch. But then a new kind of technology arrived, one built not on microscopes or lamps, but on learning, patient, careful, digital learning. This was the moment when scroll-decoding artificial intelligence stepped into the story. It became the key that finally opened a door everyone thought was locked forever. Artificial intelligence had already been trained on thousands of other pieces from the Dead Sea Scrolls. These pieces came in all sizes and conditions, from long, clear columns of text to tiny scraps with only a few symbols left. By studying them, the system learned how ancient scribes formed letters, repeated habits, and followed patterns. It built a deep memory of every curve, stroke, and spacing rule. With time, the machine became skilled at recognizing scribal behavior. It could tell when a letter was missing and predict what shape should fill the space. It could even guess how a scribe might adjust a line when the parchment was uneven. The system also learned to identify linguistic patterns. Ancient Hebrew and Aramaic followed strict rhythms, repeated structures, and recognizable phrases. By feeding thousands of lines into the AI, researchers taught it how sentences were normally formed. When letters were missing, the machine could fill in the gaps using probability models. It did not guess wildly. Instead, it used everything it had learned about grammar, spacing, and style to propose the most likely reconstruction. Over time, this allowed the AI to bring clarity to fragments that seemed completely unreadable. Several powerful technologies worked together to support this process. One important tool was AI handwriting analysis. This method had already been used to study the Great Isaiah Scroll, helping researchers discover that more than one scribe had contributed to the writing. The same method was now used to examine faint lines on damaged parchment. Even when letters could not be seen clearly, the AI could detect tiny pressure marks or patterns invisible to the human eye. Another important tool was machine learning ink reconstruction. This technology was trained to restore ink strokes that had faded almost completely. It learned how ink normally spread on parchment and how it broke apart over time. Using this knowledge, the system could rebuild strokes that were no longer visible. What appeared as a shadow to the human eye became a full letter under the digital reconstruction. Neural networks also played a major role. These systems specialized in predicting sentence structure. They could take half a word or half a sentence and rebuild the rest with surprising accuracy. They worked especially well for ancient languages that had consistent patterns. When a line was missing major sections, the neural network could give several possibilities, allowing researchers to choose the most reasonable one. Then came the final step, rebuilding the physical surface using three-dimensional scanning. Burnt or crushed parchment often holds tiny grooves, ridges, and cracks that match the original strokes of ink. Three-dimensional texture mapping allowed the AI to read these micro marks. It could follow the path where a reed pen once pressed into the parchment. By combining the physical map with the predicted ink patterns, the system rebuilt the missing shapes far more accurately than any past method. The fragment that had been locked away for years turned out to be an ideal challenge for this new technology. It had large gaps where text had simply vanished. The ink had faded so thoroughly that traditional imaging could not help. The parchment held so many cracks that the surface looked like a puzzle scattered into countless pieces. This fragment pushed every tool to its limit. The machine had to reconstruct letters from almost nothing. It had to predict missing words using language patterns learned from thousands of other fragments. It had to follow faint scratches and marks to rebuild the shapes the original scribe made with the reed pen. Every part of the process demanded patience, precision, and deep analysis. To the researchers, it felt as if the technology was breathing life into something that had gone dark centuries ago. Slowly, piece by piece, line by line, the silent fragment began to speak. As its curves and strokes returned, so did the message it held. And for the first time since it was placed in storage, the fragment finally revealed its long-hidden words. But what did the AI reveal, and why did it leave scholars shaken? The first words revealed. When the artificial intelligence system began its slow and careful work on the forgotten fragment, scholars expected a few scattered letters at best. Instead, what emerged in the first stage of decoding felt like a soft voice calling from across 2,000 years. Shapes that once looked like random scratches began forming into clear strokes. Gaps that seemed impossible to fill started to make sense, word by word. the lost message stepped out of silence, and every new detail pushed researchers deeper into curiosity. The first breakthrough came when the AI managed to rebuild entire clusters of letters. These were not complete sentences, but they were far more than anyone had hoped. In a section where the original parchment was nearly bare, the system restored enough strokes to reveal several connected words. Some were familiar, found in other writings from the same desert region. Others were rare, appearing in only one or two other manuscripts across the entire collection of ancient texts. These unusual terms instantly caught attention because they hinted at ideas that were not common in most known writings from Qumran. The presence of such rare words suggested that the author might have belonged to a group with special teachings or uncommon traditions. Another surprise appeared in the shape of the letters themselves. The strokes did not match the style known from the majority of scrolls written by scribes in the Qumran area. The angles, spacing, and flourishes were slightly different. Some lines curved where they normally stayed straight. Some letters rose higher than expected. This created an exciting puzzle. If the handwriting did not match any of the known scribes, then who wrote it? The AI, comparing thousands of samples, concluded that the hand was unique. This finding alone changed everything. It meant that the fragment might come from a writer who had not yet been identified, possibly someone working outside the main scribal tradition of the settlement. With individual words and strokes slowly becoming clearer, the next challenge was identifying the type of text preserved in the fragment. Scholars hoped to understand whether it belonged to a prayer, a rule, a legal instruction, or something far more dramatic. The AI analyzed patterns in the sentence structure, even in the incomplete sections. It searched for repeated phrases, typical openings, and familiar rhythms found in ancient Hebrew writing. Once enough of the structure was visible, it began comparing it with known genres from the scrolls. The results pointed toward three possible categories. The first was a set of rules, often linked with visions of future conflict. Texts of this type usually describe battles between good and evil forces, with detailed instructions for community members. Certain phrases in the fragment matched the structure found in these writings, raising the possibility that it belonged to an early version of a war or end-time rule. The second possibility was a community warning. Some scrolls were written to guide members on how to behave, how to prepare for hardship, or how to avoid falling into danger. A few words in the fragment seemed to carry a cautionary tone. They hinted at a voice speaking to a group, urging them to remain alert. Even though the fragment was incomplete, the general pattern felt similar to other guidance texts from the region. The third possible category was a prophetic or visionary account. These works often describe symbolic images, dreams, or messages believed to come from a higher power. The rare terms found in the fragment strengthened this idea because such words often appear in writings that deal with unusual experiences or supernatural events. When experts reviewed the early AI findings, they reacted with deep interest. Some leaned toward the idea that the text once belonged to a visionary account because of the strange vocabulary. Others argued that the structure resembled the early steps of a community rule. A few suggested that it might hold pieces of both, which would not be unusual in the complex world of ancient writings. Even with the debate, everyone agreed on one point. The fragment contained something important, something that did not match the simpler texts once thought to be its home. The first stage of decoding did more than restore letters. It opened questions no one had asked before. It made scholars rethink old beliefs about the community that lived by the Dead Sea. And most of all, it set the stage for what the next stage of the AI's work would reveal. Because if the first scattered words were already this unusual, the full message hiding beneath the damage might hold something far more surprising. The warning hidden in the fragment. When the fragment finally began to reveal its message, scholars felt a quiet chill, not because the words carried anything supernatural, but because the voice from the past spoke of real danger, real fear, and real events that shaped history. The tone was steady and urgent, as if the writer had seen something dark approaching. It was not meant to frighten with visions beyond the natural world. Instead, it warned of the kind of destruction people can bring upon one another. Every line felt like a whisper from someone who lived through tension and wanted others to prepare. The early translation showed that the text carried a warning tone from its first pieces. Even in its broken form, the fragment spoke of trouble nearing a community already living with pressure from outside forces. It used strong terms to describe coming hardship, suggesting that danger was moving closer day by day. It urged the group to remain pure and separate from others, as if blending with outside society would place them at even greater risk. This type of instruction appeared in other texts of the time, but here it was sharper. The writers seemed to be calling for clear boundaries because they believed chaos was unavoidable. The fragment also pointed toward real historical events that scholars already know shaped the region in the final centuries before the 1st century. One likely reference was the rise of Rome. Several hints in the wording matched the fear many communities felt as Roman power spread across the land. The writer may have witnessed early signs of the control that would later become crushing. Another clue pointed to conflict between Jewish sects. This was a period when different groups often disagreed strongly with each other. Sometimes the tension grew into open fighting, dividing villages and families. The fragment's focus on internal threats matched this reality. It suggested a world where danger did not only come from foreign armies, but from rival groups and arguments among people who once trusted each other. There were also signs hinting at famine or economic collapse. Several phrases that described hunger and breakdown of order lined up with known periods of severe hardship in the region. Scholars compared these hints with records of droughts, shortages, and political instability. The connections fit too well to ignore. Instead of mystical warnings, the text seemed to reflect the fear of real events pressing in on everyday life. What truly unsettled scholars was how closely the fragment seemed to foreshadow disasters that did happen some decades later. It described a society breaking apart, with homes destroyed and communities divided. It mentioned pressure on sacred places, which could relate to the growing threat against the temple in Jerusalem long before its destruction. These early signs had been noted by many groups, but the fragment captured them with unusual sharpness. It was as if the writer sensed the path that history was beginning to take. The fragment also warned of betrayal from within the community. This was striking because most writings from Qumran emphasized unity and shared purpose. This text, however, suggested that some people among them might bring harm or confusion disguised as loyalty. A few phrases, reconstructed carefully by the AI, mentioned people who stood close but brought ruin, or who weakened the walls of trust from the inside. Scholars found this unusual, since it reflected a deep level of fear and suspicion that was not common in the surviving texts. One of the most discussed lines described a city that would be burned and divided. Another noted a breach in the sanctuary, hinting at conflict that would reach even the most sacred places. The words felt more like observations than predictions, shaped by the writer's view of their time. They pointed toward a world where social cracks were widening faster than anyone could fix them. The implications of these findings were far-reaching. The fragment suggested that the community believed danger did not only come from powerful outsiders, but also from their people. Internal betrayal, secret divisions, and rising fear might have weakened the group long before any outside force reached them. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.